Hello, and welcome to the Perspectives in History podcast. I'm your host, Willem Kahn. Thank you very much for listening. This is episode 1 of our series on the Iron Guard, entitled The Plot Against Romania. A few housekeeping items before we begin. Firstly, I unfortunately had to delay the release of the final episode in the series on the Marquis de Lafayette. I got too caught up with coursework around the time it was supposed to be released, and I was unable to make the necessary edits to the script in time. I'm still working on it and hope to release it soon, but for the time being I wanted to go ahead and get started on this next series. The release will be backdated to November 29th, 2025 for the sake of continuity, so you likely won't receive a notification when it releases. I'll do my best to announce it when it does. Hopefully it'll be before the end of this month. As for this new series, it currently runs for 6 episodes, so barring any major changes, it should wrap up in early March. I'm undecided as to what should come after this one, but once I make up my mind, I will let you know. As always, I'm open to suggestions for future topics, so please feel free to run any ideas by me. Anyway, that does it for housekeeping announcements, so let's move on. Of the numerous fascist movements to have emerged in Europe between the World Wars, the Romanian Legion of the Archangel Michael, better known as the Iron Guard, was one of the most successful and longest-lived, but also one of the least understood. It's also unique among the others in a few respects. For one, this movement emerged independently of fascism in its German or Italian iterations. Secondly, it is one of the few interwar European fascist movements to have acquired a mass character and actually come to power. It also went through all 5 stages of fascism as identified by Robert Paxton in 1988, those being 1. The initial creation of the movement, 2. The rooting of the movement as parties in a political system, 3. The acquisition of power, 4. The exercise of power, and 5. Radicalization or entropy. In this series of the podcast, we will follow this movement as it goes through each of these stages over the course of about a decade and a half. In the process, I hope to shed light on this fascinating yet relatively understudied topic. Before we get into the narrative, though, I'd like to make a few disclaimers. Firstly, I preemptively apologize if I mispronounce any Romanian names in the course of this series. I've done my best to pronounce everything correctly, but since I don't speak Romanian, there's bound to be some mistakes. If by chance you speak Romanian and catch me mispronouncing anything, please don't hesitate to tell me. I won't be offended, I promise. On to the second and more important disclaimer, I will state that this series of the podcast is in no way intended to glorify or condone the actions or beliefs of the Iron Guard. Really, that statement applies to every individual or group that has been a focus of this podcast. I feel the need to say this here because I understand that fascism remains a controversial subject to say the least. My intention with this series and with the podcast as a whole is to remain as objective as possible. I believe it is not the place of the historian to make moral judgments, and I've tried to be very deliberate while writing the script for this series. But, like anyone else, I'm not perfect. If there's anything that you, the listener, may take issue with, I'm more than happy to discuss it. Finally, I'd like to offer a sincere thank you to the library at the University of Chicago for allowing me access to the sources that I used while researching this series. I've wanted to cover this subject for some time, really since I first began writing for the podcast in 2018. But for the longest time I was unable to find any reliable academic sources about it. I was able to find them eventually through the UChicago library system, and without them the series would not have been possible. Speaking of which, I'd like to briefly describe the sources that I used to research this series. In the bibliography listed in this episode's description, you will see 10 sources listed. Of these, 3 are primary and 7 are secondary. The primary sources are For My Legionaries by Corneliu Zelea Codreanu, The History of the Legionary Movement by Horia Sima, and The Suicide of Europe by Michel Sturza. The first 2, the books by Codreanu and Sima, are especially valuable as primary sources, since they were written by the first and second leaders of the Iron Guard respectively. Originally published in 1936, For My Legionaries is considered the foundational text of the Iron Guard. It's often compared to Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, and not without reason. Much like Mein Kampf, For My Legionaries is an amalgamation of personal memoir and political manifesto. It's therefore a valuable source to better understand the mind of the man who founded this movement. It's also proved incredibly useful in filling in the biographical gaps of Codreanu's early life and the prehistory of the movement that he founded. That said, all the usual precautions about the reliability of primary source documents definitely apply here. This book was not intended as an objective account of the events that it describes, and so claims made by the author should be regarded with scrutiny. Furthermore, I should say that For My Legionaries is not an enjoyable read by any means, and unless you're interested in it for academic purposes, it's really not worth reading. Pretty much everything that I've said about Codreanu's book applies to Sima's as well, although I'll clarify that Sima's book is more of a straightforward history than a memoir, and was written sometime after the events that it describes. Then we have The Suicide of Europe, the memoirs of Michel Sturza. Unlike the other two, Sturza will not be a central character in this narrative. He was a nobleman and career diplomat in interwar Romania, and also an unrepentant fascist. This book, which he wrote from exile in Spain in the 1960s, is, to his credit, far better written than either Codreanu's or Sima's, and offers an interesting glimpse into Romanian politics at a high level, but again, his primary purpose in writing this was, for the lack of a better term, historical revisionism, and as such, it should be approached with caution. Moving on to our secondary sources, each of the 7 fall into one of 3 categories. First, there are general works about the Iron Guard, really just 2. The Green Shirts and the Others by Nicholas Nagy Talavera, and The Legionary Movement After Codreanu by Ilarion Tew. The former of these, the one by Nagy Talavera, is significantly older than the other secondary sources I have listed here, originally being published in 1970. As far as I can tell, it was the only English-language monograph on the subject of the Iron Guard for quite some time. The author is also an interesting figure in his own right, if you'll allow me a brief aside. He was born to Jewish parents in Hungary in 1929, but spent most of his childhood in Romania. At just 14 years old, he was sent to the Auschwitz concentration camp and managed to survive the ordeal, only to be arrested by Soviet intelligence 5 years later. Charged with espionage and sentenced to 25 years hard labor, he was granted amnesty after 7 years and later immigrated to the United States, acquiring a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, and later teaching at California State University. His academic interest in the Iron Guard stems from his experience of living as a Jewish person in Romania at the time the organization was active. He allegedly even met Codreanu, the leader of the group, when he was a child, an anecdote that he includes in the book. The Legionary Movement After Codreanu by Ilarion Tew is basically what the title says. A straightforward political history of the organization from 1938 until its effective dissolution in 1941. This may seem like a short period of time, but it was a highly consequential one, and this book does a very good job going over all the various political intrigues of the Guard in these critical years. The second category of secondary sources are those that explore specific aspects of the Iron Guard. The Sword of the Archangel by Radu Ioanid, which covers the group's ideology, The Fascist Faith of the Legion Archangel Michael by Constantin Iordachi, which delves into the religious dimension of the group, and Holy Legionary Youth by Roland Clark, which focuses on the more mundane aspects of the Iron Guard, its organizational structure, political activities, and so on. Each of these topics are ones that we will explore in depth over the course of this series, and this analysis would not be possible without these works. Then, finally, there are 2 secondary sources which pertain more to the history of Romania generally. A Concise History of Romania by Keith Hitchins, and Balkan Ghosts by Robert Kaplan. Hitchins' book is an excellent single-volume history of Romania in the modern age, mostly concentrated on the 20th century. While Kaplan's book is more of a travel journal written in the 1990s, a significant portion of which is dedicated to Romania. It's less a work of history and more one of anthropology. I mainly relied on it for its insights into cultural memory in Romania, how the events that we'll discuss in this series were remembered by the average Romanian some 50 or 60 years after they transpired. But we'll save most of that for the final episode of this series. Anyway, that does it for our discussion about sources. Again, thanks to the University of Chicago Library System for helping me to locate and access most of these works. Anyway, let's proceed with the narrative. In order to properly tell the story of the Iron Guard, it's necessary to provide some background information on the history of Romania in the modern era, if for no other reason than the rise of fascism in Romania does not seem to make sense upon first glance. Indeed, Romania differed greatly from the other countries whose politics took a decidedly right-wing turn in the interwar period. For instance, Italy, Germany, and even neighboring Hungary. Like the other movements to which it is often compared, Romanian fascism came about in the aftermath of the First World War. However, in order to properly understand the Iron Guard, it's necessary to go back even further than 1914, prior to the outbreak of World War I. The history of modern Romania can be considered to have begun in the year 1859, when the two previously distinct principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia unified under the leadership of Prince Alexandru Ioan Cuza. It would not be until 1879, however, that the United Principalities gained their independence from the suzerainty of the Ottoman Empire, which they had been subjected to on and off since the early to mid-15th century. However, nominal independence did not mean that Romania would cease to be an object of great power politics. Cuza, the man responsible for Romanian unification, was pressured to abdicate in 1866. His successor was Prince Karl of Hohenzollern-Sigmaringen, a member of the ruling dynasty of the Kingdom of Prussia. Romania was officially elevated to the status of kingdom itself in 1881, with Karl, now dubbed Carol I of Romania, as its first official head of state. The young nation of Romania entered the 20th century having just barely emerged from a quasi-feudal socio-economic order. The economy was based almost entirely on agriculture. In fact, industry made up less than 1.5% of the Romanian economy as of 1914. As such, the quote-unquote peasant question was considered to be of great importance, and for the most part, it was a question that would remain unsolved until it was far too late. When the Great War broke out in 1914, Romania announced its neutrality. However, this policy was not sustainable in the long term, and eventually Romania would have to choose one faction or the other. This was not an obvious choice, and the country's leadership was divided on this matter. On one hand, the king at the time of the July crisis, Carol I, was a blood relative of the German Emperor, Wilhelm II, and naturally sympathized with the Central Powers. Public sentiment, on the other hand, was overwhelmingly in support of the Entente and Romania's historical ally, France. Due to this deadlock, the policy of neutrality was maintained for the first 2 years of the war. A number of factors contributed to Romania's entry into the war in August 1916. Firstly, there was the death of King Carol I and the ascension of his son, Ferdinand I, who despite his Hohenzollern lineage, had little sympathy for his cousin, the Kaiser. Then, there was the simple fact that all of Romania's diplomatic ties with the Central Powers could not erase the fact that there was a sizable amount of territory with an ethnic Romanian majority under the control of the Central Powers, namely Austria-Hungary. Joining the war on the side of the Triple Entente provided the Romanians a priceless opportunity to liberate their brethren in Transylvania, Bukovina, and Banat, greatly enlarging the size of their country and achieving their long-held national ambitions. These ambitions were tempered greatly by the fact that the country existed in a very strategically disadvantageous position. It was surrounded by the Austro-Hungarian Empire to the north and west, and Bulgaria to the south. The only way that they could hope to successfully wage war against the Central Powers was to rely on significant support from Russia, which bordered Romania to the northeast. Early Russian setbacks on the Eastern Front initially discouraged Romania's entry into the war. However, the opportune moment presented itself in the summer of 1916 when the Brusilov offensive pushed Austro-Hungarian forces back in the east, and the Sixth Battle of the Isonzo put pressure on them in the west. After a long and drawn-out series of negotiations, Romanian Prime Minister Ion Brătianu managed to extract from the Allied powers a promise that Romania would be awarded these aforementioned territories in the event of the Entente's victory. The terms were finalized on August 16, 1916, and Romania declared war on the Central Powers the following week. The Romanian offensive into Transylvania met with initial success, but it quickly stalled out, and a counterattack by the combined forces of Germany and Austria-Hungary forced them back. Although Romania's army was rather large in proportion to the size of its population, the war exposed the ultimate weaknesses of its supply and organization. They were simply outmatched by the Austro-Hungarians and especially their German allies. Despite considerable losses of territory, manpower, and materiel, the Romanians fought on valiantly, winning a couple of significant victories at Marasti and Marasesti. However, this could not prevent the Central Powers from seizing the capital city of Bucharest before the end of the year, forcing the king and his government to flee to the relative safety of Iasi. The decisive blow to the Romanian war effort came the following year, when the October Revolution led to Russia's complete and total withdrawal from the war. Now cut off from its allies, Romania agreed to an armistice with the Central Powers on December 9th, and on May 7th of the following year, they were compelled to sign the Treaty of Bucharest, leaving the country entirely dependent on the Central Powers both politically and economically. As humiliating as this state of affairs was, it would not last long, as the war would ultimately end with the victory of Romania's Entente allies. The Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed, and Romanian soldiers re-entered the regions of Transylvania, Bukovina, and Banat, all of which held plebiscites voting overwhelmingly in favor of union with the Kingdom of Romania. These new territorial boundaries were reaffirmed at the end of the 1919 Paris Peace Conference with the treaties of Versailles and Trianon. The incorporation of the formerly Austro-Hungarian territories of Transylvania, Bukovina, and Banat into the Romanian state represented the culmination of the ambitions held by Romanian nationalists ever since the revolutions of 1848. The so-called Great Union had finally been established. However, although, in the words of Nagy Talavera, quote, a greater Romania beyond the wildest hopes and dreams of the decade had been established, end quote, the accomplishment of this nationalist dream did not usher in a new era of stability and prosperity. As a matter of fact, the politics of the interwar period in Romania were characterized by political instability, the degradation of democratic institutions, and a steady descent into right-wing authoritarianism. In the years between 1918 and 1941, Romania was ruled by no fewer than 25 different governments, most of which were either quasi-fascistic or outright fascist, and all of which were relatively short-lived. The Iron Guard, although it never achieved the same degree of power as their fascist counterparts in Italy or Germany, was the most prolific political formation to emerge from this period of tumult that followed the First World War. Given the nature of the Iron Guard, seeing as how it very much would become a cult of personality, it's not possible to fully understand this organization without first understanding its founder, Corneliu Zelea Codreanu. To give you an idea of the way that his supporters thought of him, I'll now read a brief excerpt from Michel Sturza's memoir, The Suicide of Europe. Quote, all great changes in human history are provoked by the simultaneous occurrence of two events, a paroxysm in the collective aspirations of a human group, and the appearance of a creative personality, essentially representative of those aspirations, with enough spirituality to bring them to life, and with enough discernment to steer their course to lasting realization. Such a person for Romania was Corneliu Zelea Codreanu. End quote. Codreanu was born on September 13, 1899, in Huși, a small town in northern Moldavia. For someone who had become such a fervent Romanian nationalist, it's worth looking into Codreanu's ethnic background. For one, his parents were newcomers to Romania, having immigrated from Bukovina, which was then a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. His mother, Elizabeth, whose surname was originally Brunner, was of German descent, and as for his father, Ioan, his ethnic makeup is a bit more difficult to ascertain. Prior to immigrating from Bukovina, Ioan's surname had been Zelensky, a distinctly Slavic name, suggesting either Ukrainian or Polish ancestry. It was only after he came to Romania that he changed his name, Romanianizing it to Zelea, and adding an additional Romanian surname, Codreanu. Despite his dubious ethnic origins, the elder Codreanu devoted himself to the cause of Romanian nationalism with, quote, all the zeal of a convert, end quote. He became a close associate of Alexandru C. Cuza, a professor turned far-right anti-Semitic politician. Codreanu attended high school at the Mănăstiri de la Lui, a local monastery that had been converted into a military academy. Of his education in this environment, Codreanu later wrote, quote, I received a strict soldierly education with a healthy confidence in my own powers. In fact, my military education will be with me all my life. Order, discipline, and hierarchy, molded into my blood at an early age, along with the sentiment of soldierly dignity, will constitute a guiding thread for my entire future activity. End quote. When Romania entered the Great War on the side of the Entente, Codreanu, then 17 years old, left home in the hopes of joining his father on the front lines. To his immense disappointment, he was sent home on account of his age. Not to be discouraged, Codreanu continued to attend the military academy in the hopes of being deployed to the front once he qualified for service. However, by the time he finally matriculated in 1919, the war had already ended. But while the war had technically resulted in a victory for Romania, It appeared to many, including Codreanu and many of his classmates, that the threat to the nation had not yet subsided. The year 1919 represents a pivotal moment in world history. It was at this point that the first stirrings of fascism could be detected in Europe. Now, the reason why I chose to begin this episode with an overview of Romania's involvement in the First World War is because it's not really possible to understand the rise of fascism outside the context of the Great War, as it was referred to at the time. Many scholars, people far more knowledgeable on the subject than myself, including Antonio Gramsci, have posited that fascism came about as a consequence of the economic, political, and ideological crises that resulted from the war. As Radu Ioanid put it in his study of Romanian fascist ideology, quote, "The Great War accelerated the process of social mobility, brought the masses closer to radicalism, and increased the willingness of the public to accept social change." End quote. The most pronounced effects of the war could be observed throughout Europe between the years of 1917 and 1923. The aforementioned October Revolution, which knocked Russia out of the war, represented only the beginning. Subsequent socialist revolutions broke out in Germany and Hungary, and elsewhere in Europe, mass strikes and army mutinies broke out, threatening to completely topple the existing social order. However, it was not long before the proverbial pendulum swung to the right. In Russia, increasing opposition to the new Bolshevik government resulted in the formation of the White Movement, which in turn led to a massively destructive civil war that raged throughout the former empire. The more radical elements of the German Revolution were violently suppressed, and the nascent Hungarian Soviet Republic was crushed by the armies of neighboring Romania and Czechoslovakia. This reactionary backlash against socialist revolution paved the way for fascism to rise. And as I stated earlier, this period saw some of the first stirrings of the ideology. In Italy, Benito Mussolini and his black shirts staged their famous March on Rome, seizing control over the Italian government in 1922. The following year, his German counterpart, Adolf Hitler, attempted to replicate this success, with dismal results. Similar developments occurred in Romania in the years immediately following the war. The country's close proximity to the hotbed of socialist revolution that was the former Russian Empire raised concerns that the Bolsheviks may attempt to export the revolution to Romania. In early 1918, Romanian troops, with Allied support, invaded Bessarabia, a region of the former Russian Empire that corresponds to the modern-day country of Moldova. Although the region had been formally unified with Greater Romania in April of that year, by early 1919, the region had yet to be completely pacified, and border clashes with Soviet-aligned forces continued. It was one day in the spring of 1919, amidst this atmosphere of great uncertainty, that Codreanu called together a meeting of about 20 of his fellow students in the Dobrina forest, just near his native town of Huși. Codreanu described this meeting as follows, quote, "I called these young comrades together to discuss a grave problem, though our life was only budding. What are we going to do if the Bolsheviks invade us? My opinion, with which the others were in accord, was this: if the Red Army crossed the Dniester River and reached our region, we will not submit, but rather we will take refuge in the woods, armed. From there we will organize a center of Romanian resistance, and by skillful action, we shall shake up the enemy, and keep a spark of hope amidst the Romanian masses in villages and towns. We all took an oath in the midst of that ancient forest." End quote. Codreanu then goes on to describe how this group of young students secretly began to stockpile weapons and ammunition, and started doing training exercises in the forest as they anxiously awaited the Soviet invasion. But such an invasion never came. It is true that Soviet leadership had made plans for such a contingency, but due to developments in the Russian Civil War, they were never realized. At the same time, Romanian authorities successfully repressed a number of rebellions in the newly annexed region of Bessarabia, and were able to consolidate their control over it. From his own writing, Codreanu seems almost disappointed that he never had the opportunity to wage a guerrilla war against his nation's enemies. In autumn of that year, Codreanu enrolled at the University of Iasi, intending to study law. Iasi, which is the third largest city in the country, and the unofficial capital of the region of Moldavia, had long been considered to be the epicenter of Romanian cultural and social activity, especially by those of a more conservative bent, who considered the city to be more authentically Romanian than the cosmopolitan capital city of Bucharest. In his memoirs, Codreanu describes the excitement that he felt at finally setting foot in this historic city. Quote, Here, like a lighthouse, shines in political economy the great personality of Professor Cuza. The university became a school of nationalism. Iasi, the great Romanian thrust forward of our national greatness, ideals, and aspirations. It is from the sorrow of 1917, when here, in his troubled hours, the tormented soul of King Ferdinand found refuge. Great through its destiny of being in 1918, the city of the union of all Romanians, the great city of the 40 churches. Iasi, like Rome, is built on 7 hills, and thereby remains the eternal city of Romanianism." End quote. As he alluded to here, Codreanu was especially excited to study under Professor A.C. Cuza, a figure around whom conservatives and nationalists at the University of Iasi had grouped. Although his field of study was economics, Cuza was better known for his racial views, specifically his highly anti-Semitic theories about the Jewish people. Now, one should not get the idea that Cuza invented Romanian anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism in Romania goes back nearly as far as Jewish presence in the country can be attested to. At the turn of the century, it is estimated that there were 250,000 Jewish people living in Romania, about 3.3% of the total population. By 1930, there were about 750,000, around 4.2% of the total population. One factor which accounts for this sharp rise in Romania's Jewish population was that many Jewish refugees fleeing outbreaks of anti-Semitic violence in Russia sought asylum within Romania's borders. Geographically, Romania's Jewish population was largely concentrated in Moldavia, where they tended to reside in urban centers. Thus, the population of Iasi was between 30 and 40% Jewish at the time that Codreanu first moved there. In developing his anti-Semitic ideas, Professor Cuza could draw from a tradition of anti-Semitism that had long existed within Romanian political, artistic, and intellectual circles. For an example of this, we need look no further than the mid-19th century poet Mihai Eminescu. Widely regarded as the most famous and influential Romanian poet, Eminescu is sometimes referred to as the William Shakespeare of the Romanian language. That said, Eminescu's political views were highly conservative and xenophobic, even by the standards of the time. Eminescu held in contempt more or less every non-Romanian ethnic group: Austrians, Hungarians, Russians, Turks, the French, and so on. But he reserved his strongest vitriol for the Jewish people. He strongly opposed enfranchising Romania's Jews, arguing, quote, "The Jew does not deserve rights anywhere in Europe because he does not work." End quote. Eminescu saw Jews as the primordial enemies of the Romanian nation and believed that they constantly schemed to dispossess the Romanian people of all they owned, including the nation itself. Quote, "Whatever one may say, between us and the Jews there is a racial difference that does not allow us to have any feelings towards them in any circumstance where honor is at stake, but contempt, and nothing but contempt." End quote. Eminescu saw eternal conflict as the natural state of relations between different races. Quote, "In general, the happy struggle between the races, the blessed struggle that awards the palm to the superiority of character, the struggle that engenders serenity and communion, is war." End quote. Eminescu's romanticized and highly chauvinistic notions of conservatism would be adopted by many Romanian intellectuals going forward, such as the historians Bogdan Hasdeu and Nicolae Iorga. What makes A.C. Cuza's particular conception of anti-Semitism unique is that it fused traditional Eastern Orthodox Christian anti-Semitism with pseudoscientific notions of anti-Semitism that were more prominent in Western Europe, particularly in Germany. By fusing these two together, Cuza created a virulent, particularly uncompromising new form of anti-Semitic thought. Unlike the scientific and secular version of anti-Semitism prominent in Western Europe, Cuza stressed that his theories were based on Orthodox doctrine, which lent it a certain popular appeal. At the same time, Cuza's assertion that the Jewish people constituted a race separate from Christians foreclosed any possibility of conversion to Christianity as a solution to the quote-unquote Jewish question. Because even if such people may appear to accept Christianity, their antagonism towards Christians and their nations was something that was hard-coded into their genome, so to speak. Given that coexistence was impossible between the two races, Cuza openly called for all Jews to be expelled from Romania, though he did not advocate for their extermination, at least, not yet. In short, these were the ideas of Professor A.C. Cuza, to whom Codreanu looked for guidance as a new student at Iasi University. On account of Cuza's association with Codreanu's father, it is quite likely that he had been exposed to these ideas from an even younger age. As he began his studies, Codreanu read the works of people like Cuza and Iorga. In his estimation, it was from these writings that Codreanu derived three main principles. Quote, 1. The unification of the Romanian people. 2. The elevation of the peasantry through land reform and political rights. And 3. Solution of the Jewish problem. End quote. It was thanks in large part to Cuza's influence that the young Codreanu, already a fervent anti-communist, came to associate communism explicitly with Judaism. And now, a word from our sponsor. And now, back to the show. Codreanu had been very excited to go to Iasi to study at the university there, but when he arrived in the city he was none too pleased with what he saw. The university, which he described as a school of nationalism, had become dominated by socialists in both the faculty and student body. These socialists had come to greatly outnumber more conservative elements at the university. As Codreanu tells it, quote, the advancement of these anti-Romanian ideas, supported by a compact mass of students and professors, and encouraged by all enemies of a unified Romania, found among the student body no Romanian resistance. A few of us who were trying to man the barricades were surrounded by an atmosphere of scorn and enmity. On the streets or in the halls of the university, colleagues holding other opinions, those with freedom of conscience, and who preach every other kind of freedom, spat at us as we passed, and became increasingly aggressive. End quote. And this state of affairs was not confined to the halls of the university. Even after Romania's domestic situation had begun to stabilize in 1919, Iasi remained somewhat of a hotbed of socialist agitation. Codreanu recalls the atmosphere of revolution that pervaded the city at the time. Quote, Iasi's mass of working men, almost entirely immersed in communism, were ready to erupt into revolution. Every 3 or 4 days there were on the streets huge demonstrations. Those 10 or 15,000 starved workers paraded down the streets, singing the Internationale and shouting down with the king, down with the army, carrying placards on which one could read, long live the communist revolution, long live Soviet Russia, end quote. In Codreanu's mind, these masses of striking workers were not the enemy. Rather, they were simply being led astray by the true enemy, the Jews, whom he had come to conflate with the communists. Quote, if these workers had been victorious, would we have had a Romania led by a Romanian workers' regime? Would the Romanian worker have become master of his own country? No. The very next day we would become slaves of the dirtiest tyranny, the Talmudic, Jewish tyranny. Greater Romania, after less than a second of existence, would have collapsed. We, the Romanian people, would have been mercilessly exterminated, killed, or deported to Siberia. Peasants, intellectuals, workers, and all. The land from the Mara Mureş to the Black Sea would have been colonized by the Jewish masses, and here they would build their true Zion. I was perfectly aware in those hours the life and death of the Romanian people were at stake, and so were the Jews that were pushing the Romanian workers into revolution. They had no sympathy with the anguish that gripped our hearts in those moments, or with the anxiety betrayed in our eyes. They knew exactly what they were doing. End quote. With the stakes this high, Codreanu realized the urgent need to act. It was not long before he fell in with an anti-communist organization called the Guard of National Consciousness. This appears to have been some sort of paramilitary group comprised mainly of local anti-communist workers. Their leader was a man named Constantin Pancu, an electrician by trade. Primarily, the Guard of National Consciousness staged counter-protests, engaged in street fights, and broke communist-led strikes. Thanks to his boldness during these actions, Codreanu gained Pancu's trust. Codreanu saw such direct action as necessary, but at the same time he recognized the fact that in order to defeat communism and win the masses over to their side, they had to propose an alternative solution to the problems that were facing them. Codreanu describes a conversation that he had with Pancu in late 1919, saying, quote, it is not enough to merely defeat communism. We must also fight for the rights of workers. They have a right to bread and honor. We must fight against the oligarchic parties, creating national workers' organizations, which can gain their rights within the framework of the state and not against the state. End quote. And so, around this time, Codreanu and Constantin Pancu took the first steps to organize these national workers' organizations that Codreanu proposed. In 1920, the government enacted a land reform that had been highly anticipated. Socialist activity in Iasi and throughout the country began to subside as a result. The League of National Consciousness, whose membership never exceeded 40 people, disbanded. Codreanu refocused his efforts and began to organize among his fellow students at the university, because he recognized the importance of winning over the impressionable youth over to his ideology. In September 1920, Codreanu attended an all-Romanian student congress held in the city of Cluj. Here, there was a debate on the question of whether Jewish students should be allowed to join Romanian student organizations. Codreanu was, of course, opposed to this, and began to agitate against such an action. According to his view, quote, "Had our point of view lost, the student organizations would have lost their Romanian character, and in contact with the Jews would have turned towards Bolshevism." End quote. Thanks in large part to Codreanu's efforts, the Congress voted against integration. Codreanu's next battle came at the beginning of the following academic year. That year, it was announced that the university would not open with a prayer service, as had been customary in the past. The university senate had made this decision in an effort to secularize the institution, but here Codreanu sensed a Judeo-communist plot. Quote, "The University of our Christian Iasi, the highest institution of Romanian learning, was thus proclaiming in those difficult times the fight against God, the banishment of God in our schools, institutions, and across the country. The professors of the university, save for 4 or 5 who opposed this trend, welcomed with great satisfaction the heathen decision of the Senate as a step forward that would take Romanian science out of barbarism and medieval preconceptions. The communist students were jubilant, and the Jews triumphant, while a few of us pondered sorrowfully. We wondered how long it would be before our churches were torn down, and priests' investments were crucified on their own altars." End quote. Codreanu decided once again to take direct action to protest this decision. By that time, Codreanu had become the president of a tight-knit group of far-right students who called themselves the Association of Christian Students. Although this group was rather small in proportion to the rest of the student body, thanks to Codreanu, they were well organized and willing to take drastic measures to force the school administration to concede to their demands. Together, Codreanu and his group physically blocked the main entrance to the university, refusing to allow anyone to enter until the annual prayer service was held. Eventually, the administration caved, and the prayer service was held 2 days later. The rest of the academic year of 1920-1921 was marked by, in Codreanu's words, quote, "an unending series of clashes and battles." End quote. Here, Codreanu's past with Constantin Pancu and the League of National Consciousness became useful. Codreanu and his group violently interrupted meetings where they thought that communist beliefs were being aired, and prevented the student body from going on strike on at least one occasion. At one point, they even went so far as to ransack the offices of a local newspaper that had reported negatively about their behavior. Before long, the university administration took action against Codreanu and expelled him without a hearing. This decision did not stand for long because Professor Cuza spoke up in Codreanu's defense and had him reinstated as a student. Before long, though, he got back up to his old antics, continuing to organize among his fellow students. He completed his courses in 1922 and should have received his degree, but allegedly the university administration refused to give it to him. Therefore, Codreanu never technically graduated from the University of Iasi. In the summer of 1922, a Jewish theater troupe visited the city. Codreanu saw the staging of Jewish plays in Romanian theaters as a threat to Romanian culture. Quote, "We saw it as the beginning of an alienation of this institution, meant to be for the national and moral education of the Romanian people. Our theaters were built by the Romanian sweat and money, and they will not serve Jewry for the preparation and strengthening of their forces against us. It was the duty of others, namely the government, to take a stance against this new anti-Romanian attack, but none was taken." End quote. Once again, it fell to him to take direct action. Codreanu and his group of fellow students burst into the theater, throwing whatever they could at the Jewish actors and chasing them from the stage. He conceded that his critics may have found his methods uncivilized, but he justified them in the following manner, quote, "How civilized is it that an alien nation dispossesses me, one after another, of all the goods of my country? How civilized is it when the same nation poisons my culture and then serves it on the stage? To what extent were the means used by Jews in Russia civilized? How is it civilized to slaughter millions of people without trial? To what extent is it civilized to set fire to churches or to transform them into cabarets?" End quote. In the autumn of 1922, Codreanu decided to move to Germany with the intention of furthering his studies. He went first to Berlin, where he saw a city still devastated by the effects of war, orphans begging on the streets, workers idle from lack of employment, people selling their properties for ridiculously low rates, and so on. Still, he admired the spirit of perseverance he perceived among the German people. Quote, "It was still a healthy people, and I could see that it would not permit itself to be knocked down, and that it would, with unsuspected powers, resurrect itself from beneath the rock of the difficulties burdening it." End quote. Overall, Codreanu's time in Germany was rather short and uneventful. It was during this time that he was first told of the rise of fascist movements elsewhere in Europe. While in Berlin, a friend of his told him of Adolf Hitler, a 36-year-old painter who had started an anti-Semitic movement in Munich. It was also at this time that Codreanu first heard of the March on Rome and the victory of Benito Mussolini's fascist movement. He describes the joy and excitement he felt upon hearing this news, saying, quote, "I rejoice as much as if it were my own country's victory. There is, among all those who in various parts of the world serve their own people, a kinship of sympathy, as there is such a kinship among those who labor for the destruction of peoples. Mussolini, the brave man who trampled the dragon underfoot, was one of us. That is why all the dragon heads hurled themselves upon him, swearing death to him. For us, he will be a bright north star giving us hope, living proof that the Hydra can be defeated, proof of the possibilities of victory." End quote. The fact that the ideology Mussolini espoused was not explicitly anti-Semitic did not give Codreanu pause. He claimed that, quote, "Had Mussolini lived in Romania, he could not be anything but anti-Semitic, for fascism means first and foremost defending your nation against all the dangers that threaten it. It means the destruction of these dangers and the opening of a free way of life and glory for your nation." End quote. After having struggled to make ends meet in Berlin, Codreanu moved to the nearby town of Jena. It was here in December 1922 that he received distressing news from Romania. That month, the government announced that it had drafted a new constitution that it intended to formally adopt the next year. This constitution included a provision that granted full citizenship and political rights to Romania's Jewish population. This news provoked a decidedly negative reaction from among Romanian students. In universities across the country, students went on strike, demanding that the government enact a quota on Jewish admission to Romanian universities. Codreanu made the decision to cut his stay in Germany short to return to Romania, in the hopes of assuming some sort of leading role in these student protests. He immediately boarded a train bound first for the city of Cernăuți, now a city in Ukraine called Chernovisti. Cernăuți was, and still is, host to a major university. When Codreanu stopped briefly at this university, he spoke in glowing terms of what he saw. Quote, "The university was closed. The students guarding it seemed like soldiers serving their country, their souls enlightened by God. No trace of personal interest clouded their beautiful and sacred action. The cause for which they banded together and fought was one that went much beyond themselves and their constant privations and needs." End quote. But while Codreanu was very much taken by the zeal of the striking students, he disagreed with them when it came to strategy. They told him that their primary demand was the enactment of a numerus clausus, i.e. a Jewish quota. To Codreanu, this did not seem like a permanent enough solution, saying, quote, "Numerus clausus is only a formula of redistribution of Jews, not a formula for solving the problem." End quote. Rather, Codreanu had much more grandiose plans in mind. He had his eyes set on creating a national movement, not simply confined to the universities, but one that could appeal to all Romanians. He believed that this movement should be highly centralized, and should aspire to take power at the highest level, since no existing political party seemed willing to do what was necessary to, quote, "resolve the national problem." End quote. With these aims in mind, Codreanu began traveling from city to city, helping to organize the ongoing student protests. However, he found that the other student leaders did not share his grandiose ambitions. The majority of the striking students were not fervent anti-Semites like Codreanu. As Zvi Yavets, a professor at the University of Cernăuți, observed, quote, "Any academic degree could guarantee some government job and would satisfy most Romanian students who came from primitive villages, were poor, and hoped to be absorbed into the growing cities. However, the number of places in the student dormitories were limited, rents were high, and government scholarships were few. Jewish students, who came from urban areas primarily, lived at home with their parents, and even if they were not rich, appeared as such in comparison to Romanian students. Any anti-Semitic propaganda thus fell on fertile ground." End quote. Rather than taking power at a national level, the students were ultimately more interested in having their immediate material concerns addressed. As Codreanu put it, quote, "Neither the leadership nor the student body knew the Jewish problem, particularly did not know the Jew. They were not aware of the Judaic power, its way of thinking and of action. They had begun waging war without knowing the adversary." End quote. Despite the size of the student protest movement, the Romanian government made no indication that they would make any changes to the new constitution. By March 1923, the student protest appeared to be losing momentum. In a last-ditch effort to harness the energy of these protests and channel it into concrete political action, Codreanu, together with Cuza, made plans for a mass rally where they would inaugurate a new political party. Cuza proposed the new party be called the League of Christian National Defense, also known by the Romanian acronym LANC. The party's standard was to be the Romanian blue, yellow, and red tricolor with a swastika in the center. The use of the swastika, which is more famously associated with the Nazi Party in Germany, was a particular proclivity of Professor Cuza. He denied that he copied the Nazis in using the symbol, or even that he was influenced by them in any way. He claimed that the swastika was a distinctly Romanian symbol. Quote, "The swastika is linked to the cult of the sun. It appears in the countries inhabited by the Pelasgic race, which we find from the very beginning in our lands. In general, the swastika is the distinctive sign of the Aryan race. Signs were found on our soil. Being here since ancient times, the swastika, therefore, is, in the first place, ours, Romanian by its descent from the Thracian Aryans. The swastika is our national emblem." End quote. The inaugural rally of the LANC was to be held on March 4th, 1923, in Iasi. Codreanu describes the proceedings in the following way, quote, "By morning, 42 groups from across the country arrived, bearing 42 flags. We affixed them to poles, and we left for the cathedral, where the religious service was conducted before a crowd of 10,000. All 42 flags, the moment when they were to be blessed, were unfurled before the altar. Once blessed, they were to be taken throughout the country, each to have the fortress of Romanian souls rallying around it. From the cathedral, the thousands of people, banners unfurled, formed a procession through Union Square, and headed for the university. There, in the university's amphitheater, was signed the founding document of the League of Christian National Defense. That afternoon, a meeting took place in the Great Hall, presided over by General Ion Tarnoshi. Many people who could not be accommodated in the hall stood in the street. Professor Cuza was proclaimed president of the League, with great enthusiasm." End quote. Cuza's first action as president of the LANC was to appoint Codreanu as his second-in-command. In practice, Cuza entrusted Codreanu with the running of the party's operations in the field, while the professor took a more hands-off approach to leadership. On March 26th, the new Romanian constitution was approved by the parliament. In response, Codreanu issued a manifesto to the people of Iasi calling for a mass protest. Demonstrations took place in multiple locations throughout the city, with Codreanu and a few of his closest associates specifically targeting the city's Jewish quarter. Arriving there in the dead of night, the protest quickly turned violent. Quote, "No Romanian lives there. Thousands of Jews woke up and ran to and fro like a nest of worms. When we were greeted with fire, we responded with fire. We did our duty, toppling everything that stood in our path and showing the Jews that Iasi, Moldavia's ancient capital, was still Romanian, and that it is our arm which rules, which can permit or forbid, which holds peace or war, which punishes or forgives." End quote. By morning, gendarmes from a nearby town arrived in Iasi to help restore order. For his role in inciting the violence, Codreanu was arrested and spent a week in prison. It would not be his last. Upon his release, Codreanu continued to divide his efforts between the student movement and the LANC. As the year dragged on, it became more and more apparent that the student protest movement was fizzling out, having failed to enforce any of its demands on the government. In advance of the upcoming academic year, a Congress of the student movement's leaders was held in Iasi in late August. The meeting itself was largely uneventful, save for the fact that it was here that Codreanu first became acquainted with Ion Mota. Mota hailed from Orasti, a small town in southern Transylvania. His father, Ioan Mota, was an Orthodox priest, an activist for the national rights of Romanians within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Mota had studied law at various universities in both Romania and France, although by the time he met Codreanu, he was studying at the university in Cluj. Other than the fact that they were both law students, Mota and Codreanu had much in common, especially their rabid anti-Semitism. In fact, it was Mota who was responsible for producing the first Romanian language translation of the infamous anti-Semitic hoax, The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Mota, also like Codreanu, had founded his own political party, called Acțiunea Romanescă, or Romanian Action. It was based directly on the French far-right party Action Française. By 1925, it would officially merge with the League of Christian National Defense. In September 1923, the LANC held a congress in the town of Campo Lung. Here, 30 local peasants were chosen as delegates of the party. They were to go to Bucharest and present a list of demands to the Prime Minister, Ion Brătianu. Codreanu himself would lead the delegation. On arriving at the building that housed the Prime Minister's office, they were turned away, the doors shut in their faces. Codreanu repeatedly threatened to kick the door down if they were not admitted inside, and eventually, this tactic produced results. Before they knew it, Codreanu and the peasant delegation were sitting face-to-face with Prime Minister Brătianu and his cabinet. Codreanu allowed the peasants themselves to voice their demands. Quote, "Your Highness, Sir Prime Minister, we kiss your hands and keep ourselves respectfully at your feet. What do we want? We want justice, for the Jews have invaded us. They take our timber by the hundreds of train flat cars, while it rains in our homes through leaks in our roof, for we lack even shingles to cover them. We cannot keep our children in school any longer. The Jews have filled our schools, and our children have become their hired hands. We also ask for the university students, our children, that the numerous clauses be implemented as they have requested." End quote. Prime Minister Brătianu listened attentively and responded, quote, "Go home and have patience, because I will have the forest question looked into. As regards the numerous clauses, it cannot be done. Show me a single state in Europe that has introduced this measure, and I too will introduce it." End quote. Codreanu and the 30 peasants left, disheartened at Brătianu's prevarication. Quote, "We all departed holding no hope. Nothing is going to get done." End quote. Codreanu and the peasants returned to Campo Lung with nothing to show for their efforts. After debriefing with the others, Codreanu and Mota went on a hike to a nearby mountain. As they ascended, Mota proposed a bolder, new course of action in the wake of their movement's recent failings. Quote, "The students can no longer carry on the next fall, and, rather than all of us accepting the shameful capitulation after a year of struggle, it would be better to urge them to resume classes, and we, who have led them, in our movement nobly by sacrificing ourselves and taking down with us all those who we find guilty of having betrayed Romania. Let us procure handguns and fire on them, giving them a terrifying example to be long remembered throughout Romanian history. What will become of us after that? Whether we shall die or whether we shall spend the rest of our lives in prison no longer matters." End quote. Codreanu concurred wholeheartedly with Mota's proposal, adding, quote, "I agreed that the final act of our fight should be, at the price of our downfall, an act of punishment for the pygmies who, deserting the posts of great responsibility they were holding, humiliated and exposed the Romanian nation to untold dangers. We felt in that moment, bubbling in our veins, the blood which demanded vengeance for all the injustices and the long chain of humiliations to which our people have been subjected." End quote. A short time later, a group of conspirators held a secret meeting to determine how they would enact Mota's proposal. Including Mota and Codreanu, they were 8 in number, the others being Corneliu Georgescu, Alexandru Vercinescu, Ilie Garnetea, Radu Mironovici, Leonida Bandac, and Tudose Popescu. The conspirators debated among themselves as to who they should target first, the Jews themselves or their Romanian collaborators. Regarding this question, they were able to quickly reach a conclusion. Quote, "We unanimously agreed that the first and greatest culprits were the treacherous Romanians who, for Judas's silver pieces, had betrayed their people. The Jews are our enemies, and as such they hate, poison, and exterminate us. Romanian leaders who cross over into their camp are worse than enemies. They are traitors. The first and fiercest punishment ought to fall first on the traitor and second on the enemy. If I had one bullet, and I were faced with both an enemy and a traitor, I would let the traitor have it." End quote. Next, they set to work determining their targets. In the end, they wrote down the names of 6 government ministers. At the top of the list was George Margescu, the Minister of Labor, and, in the minds of the conspirators, the one person most singularly responsible for the emancipation of Jews. When it came to Jewish targets, they decided to focus on the rabbis primarily. Codreanu explains their rationale, quote, "They incite the Jewish masses to attack, and whenever a Romanian falls, he does not fall by chance. He falls because he was marked for death by a rabbi. Behind every politician who sold out, there is the brain of a rabbi who laid the groundwork and ordered the Jewish bankers to close the deal and pay him off. Behind every Jewish newspaper that inspires slander, lies, and instigation, there is a rabbi." End quote. The assassins-to-be bade farewell to their friends and family members and set out for Bucharest, where they stayed at an accomplice's house. Scarcely had they arrived when the house was surrounded by police. The conspirators surrendered without a fight. Each was escorted out of the house in handcuffs, placed into cars, and driven to the police headquarters. Codreanu recalls the thoughts that went through his mind at this time, quote, "Free men, but several hours ago, proud and determined to break the chains of our people, look what we have become. Some poor, powerless unfortunates, stiffly facing a wall by the orders of some miserable police agents, frisked like petty robbers and stripped of our personal effects. It was with this humiliation that our suffering began, which little by little would render our hearts. I think there is no greater suffering for a fighter who lives in dignity and honor than being disarmed and humiliated. Death would be sweeter than this." End quote. And that is where I will have to end the narrative for now. With Codreanu and his co-conspirators in prison, would this be the end of their movement? Would they renounce their ambitions, or would this experience only strengthen their resolve? I'm sure you already know the answer, but to hear the whole story, you'll have to tune in again in 2 weeks. In the meantime, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, or anything else you'd like for me to address, please feel free to email me at perspectivesinhistorypod@gmail.com, or reach out to me on Facebook or Twitter, links to both of which will be in this episode's description. If you enjoy the show and would like to help support it going forward, I ask you to consider purchasing some used books from me on eBay, a link will be in the description, and leaving a review of the show on whichever podcast listening platform you prefer. Anyway, this has been the Perspectives in History podcast. Thank you very much for listening, as always. I'm your host, Willem Connor, signing off.